Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. In this week's video, we want to finish up part 3 of our ongoing 3-part series on QME safety. QME safety. And up to this point in time, we've already discussed in part 1 how to properly use the complexity factors under the ML 103 and ML 104 billing levels. And then in part 2, we had an extensive discussion on safety in the face-to-face evaluation. And I want to thank you doctors who have provided feedback about this ongoing series. Many doctors have written in, number one, first commenting on the value of the discussions in this series. And then also doctors have offered their own suggestions and their own ideas as to tips, procedures, techniques, and principles that they use in the face-to-face evaluation to ensure their safety as qualified medical evaluators and to ensure that their methods will not be called into question and therefore they will not be the subject of an investigation or the subject of QME discipline. So in an upcoming discussion, I'm going to be sharing the many suggestions and new novel ideas that I've received from my member subscribers. So keep your eye out for that in the very near future. For today, we want to go on to part 3 of our series regarding ex parte communication. And this is a particularly important topic because many doctors are not aware of recent changes in the labor codes and codes of regulation that govern communications. There are communications that are acceptable and there are communications that are prohibited. And many doctors think that they can simply pick up the phone and make phone calls and those phone calls qualify as acceptable communications when in actuality they don't. Now, it's rare that a doctor is challenged or charged with ex parte communication, but when it does happen, it can subject the qualified medical evaluator to discipline, and that is not something that we want. So in today's discussion, I want to review with you what's currently known and the most current regulations that have gone into effect in 2013 that govern acceptable and prohibited communications. And as I said, this is going to be especially important for some doctors because some doctors, and it seems there's a growing number of doctors who run their QME practice with as little as staff as possible or almost with no staff. In other words, it's the doctor himself that handles all of the procedures involved with his QME practice. So for those doctors, it's particularly important to be reminded that communications have to follow very specific pathways, or else you as a qualified medical evaluator leave yourself open to accusations and charges of ex parte communication. And this is a problem for 2 basic reasons. Number one is that the aggrieved party, the so-called aggrieved party, can request a new evaluator, and you would lose the case both for now and for the future, the entire future of the case. And as we both know, many times we see these examinees multiple times, so we certainly do not want to lose even one single case now or for into the future. So that's no good. And then number 2, none of us wants to be the subject of discipline, and none of us wants to be placed on probation by either the Division of Workers' Compensation Medical Unit or perhaps even by our licensing authority. And just as a reminder, in our last discussion in part 2 on safety in the face-to-face evaluation, we talked about the necessity of disclosing to the examinee those situations and circumstances when the doctor is actually on probation with either the licensing authority or with the Division of Workers' Compensation Medical Unit. So that poses a whole new range and realm of complications. And one of those complications is that you could potentially even lose that case, both for now and into the future. So this is a good time for us to all get on the same page with regards to ex parte communications. And I think it's particularly important because in speaking with many doctors, it seems that there is some misunderstandings and some misconceptions about what does and what does not constitute ex parte communication. So I'm going to bring you up to speed with the very latest of the revisions to the labor codes and the California codes of regulation that refer to these communications. So with that as our introduction, let's begin now our part 3 of this series on QME safety with a specific discussion of ex parte communications. So let's begin with listing the key regulations that govern ex parte communication. And I want to keep today's discussion fairly brief, and we're going to move through these labor codes and codes of regulation fairly quickly, because between the 4 of these codes and regulations, we get a good flavor as to the legislative intent. The legislative intent as regards to communications. And so very little elaboration on each of these codes is going to be necessary. They are mostly self-explanatory. And I want you to know that these codes have been revised as of 2013 to consider some of the circumstances and some of the cases that came up involving difficult and controversial occasions of ex parte communication. And I'll elaborate on some of those nuances as we go through those codes and regulations. So the Big Daddy main code that governs ex parte communication is Labor Code 4062.3. And in all references of cases wherein complaints and or accusations of ex parte communication have come across the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board, Labor Code 4062.3 is the code upon which the judges rely upon for their primary decision making. They also rely on some references to ex parte communication in CCR 35, CCR 41, and CCR 60. CCR 60, which deals with QME discipline as relates to ex parte communication. So let's tackle these codes and regulations one at a time. And as I said, we're going to move through these somewhat quickly in order to simply get the main points and the main principles that are going to be the overriding themes for us as doctors when it comes to decisions about whether or not to make a phone call, whether or not to write a letter, whether or not to discuss matters with the claims adjuster, the applicant attorney, the defense attorney, and even in some situations, whether or not communications with the examinee qualify as acceptable communications or ex parte communications. Okay, so let's begin with Labor Code Section 4062.3E, which is the beginning of the discussion of communications. Now, Labor Code 4062.3 Sections A through D talk about our obligation as QMEs with regards to medical records, and also the obligations of the parties involving communications both before and after the medical evaluation. So for doctors, for our purposes, let's begin here with Section E. So Section E says that all communications, and let's go no further than all communications, okay? What does all communications mean? All communications means all communications, meaning there is no communication that is not subject to this provision. Now, communications is to be distinguished from conversations, in that conversations refers to spoken communications, whereas communications is a more general term that includes both spoken communications, as in conversations, but also other types of communications, such as emails, such as written communications, such as text messaging. In other words, all communications is an all-encompassing term. So it says all communications with a qualified medical evaluator who's selected from a panel before a medical evaluation shall be in writing and shall be served on the opposing party 20 days in advance of the evaluation. Any subsequent communication with the medical evaluator shall also be in writing and shall be served on the opposing party when sent to the medical evaluator. So what's the theory and theme of this section of Labor Code 4062.3? Is that all communications have to be in writing. Now, as we're going to see as we go on, there is only one exception to this provision, that all communications shall be in writing. There is only one exception, and case law after case law and decision after decision has upheld the fact that only one exception is written into the code. Now, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board retains authority and retains decision-making over the determination as to whether or not communications qualify as ex parte or not, and we'll discuss that as we go. But for our purposes right now, let's establish the theme that the legislature intended, and that is that all communication shall be in writing. That's our basic theme that's going to guide us from here on out, and I will elaborate on a couple of exceptions to this. Okay, let's continue with the very next section in Labor Code 4062.3. It says that communications with the agreed medical evaluator shall be in writing and shall also be served on the opposing party when sent to the agreed medical evaluator. Now, here is a new entry into this code, effective 2013. It says that oral or written communications with the physician staff, or, as applicable, with the agreed medical evaluator, relative to non-substantial matters such as the scheduling of appointments, missed appointments, the furnishing of medical records, and the availability of the report, do not constitute ex parte communication. Do not constitute ex parte communication in violation of this section unless, and here's the unless, unless the appeals board has made a specific finding of an impermissible ex parte communication. And let me give you a little bit of background on this section. What this section is indicating to us is that for non-substantial matters, the so-called procedural or administrative matters, in other words, non-substantial matters. What's the opposite of non-substantial matters? Well, the opposite of non-substantial matters is substantial matters, matters that relate to the merits of the case, right? You can imagine two parties getting together on the phone in ex parte communication and talking about the merits of the case. For example, you can imagine perhaps the claims administrator getting on the phone to the agreed medical evaluator and saying things such as, well, Mrs. Jones, you know, she this and that, and she this and that, and the claims administrator impermissibly discussing some of the merits of the case. Those are substantial matters. Well, this section refers to what are termed the non-substantial matters, the administrative matters, such as scheduling of appointments, missed appointments. Hey, did you send those medical records? I need those medical records from ABC Clinic. The availability of the report. These do not constitute ex parte communication because the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board has decided that the workers' compensation system is somewhat of an informal system. And they find it nearly impossible to regulate every single instance or every single circumstance or every single form of communication. And so they've decided that relative to non-substantial matters, relatively to simply administrative matters, these types of discussions do not constitute ex parte communication. However, they include the reservation, or they reserve the right, to still render an opinion as to whether communications, even related to non-substantial matters, could qualify as ex parte communication. So there you go. Kind of a confusing and confounding section in the code. And my recommendation on this is that you still handle everything in writing. That way there can be no controversy as to whether or not the communication was permissible or impermissible. Okay? Now, finally, Section G states that ex parte communication with an agreed medical evaluator or the qualified medical evaluator is prohibited. So there's a definitive statement right there. States that it's prohibited. If a party communicates with the agreed medical evaluator or the qualified medical evaluator in violation of subdivision E, which we just went over, it says here that the aggrieved party has a remedy to this situation of impermissible communication relative to the merits of the case or relative to even non-substantial matters. And the remedy is that the aggrieved party may elect to terminate the medical evaluation, which means that you, as the evaluator, you're done. If either of the parties have communicated with you as the evaluator, whether you're the AME or the QME, you're done. So it's up to you, doctor, to defend and guard yourself, to protect yourself from losing the case. So if any of the parties attempt to contact you by telephone or attempt to communicate to you even in writing without also serving the communication on the opposing party, you could be done. So you need to protect yourself against this remedy. The remedy is that the aggrieved party may elect to terminate the medical evaluation and seek a new evaluation from another QME, and that'll go through the entire process again as governed by 4062.1 or 4062.2, depending upon whether the injured worker is represented or unrepresented. So here's our biblical statement. Here's our law from the heavens that ex parte communication with you, doctors, is prohibited. Now, what we're going to see in later sections is that it does not matter. It does not matter if this communication is initiated by one of the parties, meaning it's initiated by the claims administrator, the applicant attorney, the defense attorney, or you. It matters not who initiates the communication. And there have been cases, particularly I'm referring to the Alvarez case, wherein a dispute arose regarding ex parte communication when the communication was, number one, initiated by the medical evaluator, and number two, when the communication referred to non-substantial matters. Now, the Alvarez case took place in 2009 before the updated regulations took place in 2013, but it still matters not. It still matters not who initiates the communication. There has been some change to Section F to allow limited communication for non-substantial matters, but there is no change to the decision as to who is involved with initiating the communication. So for the purposes of this section and this regulation, doctors do not allow incoming communications to be received by you, and then similarly do not initiate outgoing communications to any of the parties. As it says here, this communication is prohibited, and if you're called upon it by one of the parties, two things are going to happen. You may lose the case for now and into forever, and then also you may be subject to QME discipline. We'll talk about QME discipline in just a moment. Okay, let's talk about ex parte communications as it's described in California Code of Regulations number 35. Section B1 says, except as expressly provided in Labor Code Section 4062.3F, and that's one we just went over, concerning communications with the agreed medical evaluator, all communications by the parties with the evaluator shall be in writing and sent simultaneously to the opposing party when sent to the medical evaluator. Labor Code Section 4062.3F allows oral or written communications with an AME physician or the physician staff relative to non-substantive matters such as the scheduling of appointments, missed appointments, furnishing of records and reports, and the availability of the report, unless the appeals board has made a specific finding of an impermissible ex parte communication. So again, we have this confounding situation where on the one hand it says that we do have the authority when we're the agreed medical evaluator, we do have the authority to communicate with the parties orally about non-substantive matters such as scheduling of appointments. Hey, did you send those records? Hey, Mrs. Jones missed her appointment this morning, and all these non-substantive matters. However, we still are subject to the possibility of the accusation of ex parte communication, and the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board retains the authority to specifically decide as to whether or not this communication qualified as permissible or impermissible communication. So again, my recommendation is that all communications be in writing. Why take the chance? Why risk possibly losing the case? Why risk possibly being subject to QME discipline? The entire theme and theory of this three-part series on QME safety is to protect our credential and to protect our cases so that we do not lose cases, and to protect our designation as qualified medical evaluators and stay out of investigations and stay out of the realm of QME discipline. So the recommendation is that all communications be in writing. All communications be in writing, and that's the take-home message. Section J says that there's a couple of exceptions, and this is important for doctors to know. There's a couple of exceptions. Number one is that the evaluator and the primary treating physicians physicians, the primary treating physician, any secondary treating physicians, may consult as necessary to produce a complete and accurate report. When you, as the evaluator, do communicate with the employee's treating physicians, you shall note within the report any new or additional information that was received from the treating physician. And this is where you would also designate on the QME evaluator's summary form that you did indeed consult with other physicians. So if you do consult with the primary treating or secondary treating physicians, you shall note within the body of your report what the information was, or what new information it was that you gleaned from the communication with such physicians. Section K says that the appeals board shall retain jurisdiction in all cases to determine disputes arising from objections and whether ex parte contact in violation of 4062.3 or this section of the Codes of Regulations has occurred. If any party communicates with an evaluator in violation of section 4062.3, the medical director shall provide the aggrieved party with a new panel in which to select a new QME, or the aggrieved party may elect to proceed with the original evaluator. And let me tell you, if one of the parties brings a dispute regarding ex parte communication to the medical director, they're going to select a new QME. They're not going to keep you as the original evaluator. They're allowed to keep you, but let me just tell you that strategically, they're not going to keep you, and you're going to lose the case. Now, here's one of the exceptions. The exception is that oral or written communications by the employee, meaning the injured worker, or if the employee is deceased, by the employee's dependent, made in the course of the examination or made at the request of the evaluator in connection with the examination, shall not provide grounds for a new evaluator unless the appeals board has made a specific finding of an impermissible ex parte communication. So here they give us a little rope and they give us a little latitude to communicate with the examinee both during and later, subsequent to the evaluation, when that communication is in connection with the examination. But again, the appeals board retains jurisdiction to decide whether or not that communication qualified as permissible or impermissible if an objection or if a complaint should arise. So again, my recommendation is that if you need to communicate to the examinee following or subsequent to the evaluation, that the communication be limited to non-substantive matters such as scheduling specialist appointments, such as obtaining diagnostic studies and the scheduling for that. In other words, non-substantive matters, and that the communication be entirely restricted as it relates to the merits of the case. Otherwise, you open yourself up to an accusation of ex parte communication, and you're going to lose the case. Okay, let's talk about California Code of Regulations 41. There's just a brief mention here under the QME ethical requirements, and it just reiterates the fact that evaluators selected from a QME panel shall not engage in ex parte communication in violation, again, of Labor Code Section 4062.3. Well, how many times do we need to be found, quote-unquote, guilty of engaging in ex parte communication before we're subject to investigation and discipline? Well, this is described in California Code of Regulations 60. Section B says the administrative director may, based on a complaint by the medical director and following a hearing, she may suspend terminate, or place on probation a QME found in violation of a statutory or administrative duty as described in the Administrative Director Sanction Guidelines for QMEs under Section 65, ... Such violations include, but are not limited to, and here they list several different violations, and we'll just skip down to violation number 7, which says one finding by the Appeals Board of ex parte contact by the QME prohibited by Labor Code Section 4062.3. Remember, that's contact outgoing, initiated by you as the evaluator, and contact incoming, initiated by one or more of the parties. So it simply takes one finding. One finding is sufficient for you to have your QME credentials suspended, terminated, or placed on probation. So again, the recommendation is, let's just put all communications in writing. That way we protect ourselves. That way no party can accuse us of impermissible communication. Always send a copy to all parties simultaneously, and protect yourself. Protect yourself from losing the case, and protect yourself from having your QME credential placed on probation. The underlying theme is that all communications shall be in writing, both incoming and outgoing. Okay, doctors, so let's just conclude with the key point here. Labor Code 4062.3 does not distinguish between the initiator of the communication. It matters not whether the communication is initiated by the parties to you or by you to the parties. The code does not distinguish between the initiator. It just simply states that communication with the QME or the AME is prohibited. So it matters not. So if you receive a phone call from one of the parties, that could qualify as impermissible communication, and my suggestion to you is that you terminate the contact and request that any communications with you be in writing with evidence that that communication has also been served on the opposing party simultaneously. Now, it also used to be that the Labor Code section did not distinguish between the so-called administrative or non-substantial matters and the substantial matters or the merits of the case. Now, the new revision of the Labor Code does allow for communication with the agreed medical evaluator or the agreed medical evaluator's staff relative to non-substantial matters such as scheduling of appointments and what have you. However, there still is the risk that these communications could qualify as impermissible ex parte communications, and the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board still retains the authority and the jurisdiction and the decision-making power to determine how non-substantial these communications actually were, and whether or not these communications confer an advantage or new information or additional information to one or more of the parties while excluding one or more of the other parties. So my suggestion is, why take the risk? Why take the risk when it's so simple to put all communications in writing, whether those communications involve substantial matters, non-substantial matters, scheduling of appointments, any of the merits of the case? All of those communications should be in writing if you want to ensure that you're going to retain the case, if you want to ensure that you're not going to be subject to discipline, and you want to ensure that you're going to be able to see this examinee for now and into the future. Why not take a little bit of effort and simply put all communications in writing? That's the take-home message. That's the take-home theme. And I hope you adopt this procedure as part of your routine protocol from here on out. So doctors, this concludes our three-part series on QME safety. I want to thank you for your comments and input on this series. More than any series that we've done so far, I've received more feedback from more doctors, and I'll be sharing that feedback with you in a future discussion so that all of us can benefit from the experiences of all of us. So all of us can benefit from the knowledge and combined experience of all of us. So I want you to look forward to that in a future communication. For now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I want to thank you for joining me on today's video. I look forward to being with you on future videos. And for now, I'm wishing you best of success and safety in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.